John Strafford and Mark Field on the crisis convulsing the Conservative Party. But what about policy? Ian Duncan Smith's welfare reforms have been held up as a hugely important element of the Cameron government programme, but they've been personally associated to an unusual extent with Mr. Duncan Smith himself. This raises a tantalising question. Now that Mr. Duncan Smith has quit the cabinet, will his reforms, in particular his replacement of the confused benefit system inherited from New Labour with a new universal credit, vanish with him? To answer this crucial question, I invited Baroness Stroud, who, as Philippa Stroud, helped Duncan Smith mastermind his reforms through Parliament, to join me with Labour's Karen Buck, who sits on the Work and Pensions Select Committee. I asked Baroness Stroud how universal credit was going these days.
I was particularly involved right from the very beginning with Ian in the creation of universal credit, which was his big reform plan and programme, which was designed to simplify the whole of the benefit system and make work pay, so that when you moved into work, it paid more to be in work than not to work. And those reforms are being rolled out currently as we speak and are being upscaled from May. So they are for single people in almost 100% of job centres. They should be in 100% of job centres by May. And then they'll go from singles to couples to whole families. And that's how the rollout is planned.
Karen Buck, Labour supported broadly the welfare reforms, but do you feel that they are on course the way that Philippa Stroud clearly does?
Well, they're clearly on course to be finished this century. The point is that when we talk about welfare reforms, we've talked about two very different things. We've talked about a set of proposals to cut a huge amount of money out of the welfare budget, both in the last Parliament and now this. And separately to that, a plan which I think all sensible people would agree on, which is that simplifying the benefit system is a good thing and improving the work incentives are a good thing. But the fact is that the cuts that have been made in the system have made the principle of making work pay much harder to achieve, and in fact, overall and on balance, impossible to achieve.
Do you accept that, Philippa Stroud?
It's interesting what Karen says, actually, in terms of the old system making work pay. It made work pay for certain hours. So if you worked 16 hours or if you worked 35 hours a week, then you were rewarded for that decision. But actually, it didn't have any of the flexibilities that the universal credit system has. So the universal credit system rewards every hour, and every hour that you move further up the income scale. It also makes the transition in and out of work much, much simpler, so that if you're in between jobs, you don't fall out of the system in its entirety. And what Ian always wanted to do was change the incentive structures. He recognised, as most of the British public recognised, that you did need to reduce the welfare bill. And in fact, this government was elected partly to do precisely that. But he wanted to change the incentive structures and the balance within the welfare state. And that is what he was really trying to do.
But do you think, Karen Buck, that he actually managed to do that? And I suppose the secondary question is, now that we've got a new Secretary of State, do you think he will just carry on the course set for him by the ex-Secretary of State, or do you think he ought, Mr Crabb, to do something else?
I would take your first question first. I think we would still have Ian Duncan Smith as Secretary of State if he had achieved what he set out to achieve, and his resignation letter made absolutely clear that he felt he had been fatally undermined in his ability to drive forward his core agenda, which was the universal credit. So he clearly didn't. He saw George Osborne cut a huge amount of money from it. I think £5 billion has been taken out of universal credit. So although, as Philippa says, the revised system will make work pay better for some groups of people, it is actually now makes other groups of people worse off. And on balance and overall, there are more losers who lose a larger amount of money than there are gainers who gain a smaller amount of money proportionally. So, no, it didn't work. And will the system continue? Well, as, we have a snail's pace of rollout on this simplification. And I say I'm not opposed to the central thrust of universal credit. But we also, of course, have the majority of the other welfare cuts still to come. Now, we've had we had the crisis about the personal independence payments, the disability payments, that was part of what triggered Ian Duncan Smith's resignation. But we have a huge number of cuts that are in the pipeline that have already been approved by the Conservatives, which haven't yet taken effect. And they will undermine these aims in lots of other ways too, as well as pushing more children into poverty and making people worse off.
It is true, isn't it, Philippa Stroud? It's a bit of a nightmare, the fact that you had to do this fundamental reform at the time when the budget was vanishing. And so you're inevitably going to have people worse off, aren't you?
When we developed the concept of universal credit at the Centre for Social Justice, we didn't ever think about having to do it in an economic climate like this. And one of the biggest challenges is how do you do reform in an age of austerity and when a country is in recession? And that was hugely challenging for us, but we always felt that it was worth bringing in this reform. And obviously Ian left, really, his resignation, as Karen has said, is when he felt that that balance of the things you could win in government became less than the things you lost, and that was the point at which he said, no, I need to leave.
And a final question for Philippa, if I may, Karen Buck, apologise. Is this new fellow...
I have half.
All right, now you come in on it at the end. Is this Stephen Crabbe? Is he a sort of Osborneite, dazzled by money alone, or has he got the moral virtue of Mr. Duncan Smith in him?
Stephen Crabbe has been a friend for a long time, and he is an independent thinker. He is his own man, but he is a man with moral virtue and a principled man, and he will stand firm for disadvantaged people in the DWP.
And he's got the best part of £12 billion worth of welfare cuts that he's got to see people take on the chin in the next couple of years, so good luck.
That was Karen Buck and Baroness Stroud.